She's been working over 16 years with the food and drink industry to provide advice and consultancy. And she's a food allergen specialist, which is obviously why she's so important to us. And she spent 9 years managing the provision of technical contract services in the area of food allergen detection, including interpretation of testing results and delivery of consultancy, information and advice on food allergen analysis and cleaning validation for allergen removal. So you can see she very much is an expert in this field. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Helen.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lynn. I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see the slides that I've prepared for you. So thank you again for that introduction, and welcome from me as well to this session on food allergen legislation changes. As Lynn says, quite a hot topic and quite a bit happening at the moment. So in this session then, we're going to have a look at where to find legislation now that the UK is no longer an EU member state. So hopefully that's not a surprise to anybody, but I'll take you through where the legislation now is. We'll also touch on Prepap for direct sale, or you might hear me use the acronym PPDS throughout this session. And there we're talking about this new allergen labelling change, which is coming into legislation later on this year. I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail there because this is a short session for you, just to talk about deciding whether that legislation applies to you and whether you need to make the changes that it brings about. Thirdly, we're going to do a little bit of future gazing, so some possible future legislative developments to look out for. And there are particular reasons why I'm telling you to look out for these particular things. So we'll come to that a little bit later on. Let's start then with where to find the legislation now that the UK has left the EU. So this mainly depends where you're sending your products to. So where is the destination for where your products are going to be sold? So three main areas of legislation to look at here. The first is relevant to the UK. So this is retained EU legislation. So previously, a lot of legislation that the UK was working to was at EU level, and we would have our own implementing legislation to bring that into our national law and allow for enforcement. At the end of the implementation period completion day, which was 11 p.m. on the 31st of December 2020, there was a snapshot taken of the EU legislation, and it was basically lifted and shifted into retained UK law. That retained EU legislation then sits on the National Archives website. So it's the EU Exit Web Archive, and you've got the link at the bottom of the slide there. And what that source is doing then is providing that archived collection of legislation as it was relevant to the UK at the end of the IP completion day. There will be no changes made to that legislation on that particular website. To look out for changes to UK legislation, you need to be aware of legislation.gov.uk. So this is where UK versions of legislation originating from the EU are, and this is where any amendments that are made by the UK to that legislation, which are relevant to primarily GB, will be. That site also contains primary and secondary domestic legislations. That's where you find that. Just a note before I move on is around Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland is still following EU legislation. That continues to apply for on the whole, food and feed hygiene and safety laws. That's because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So retained EU law doesn't apply in Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, they're still following EU legislation, and that's also what you would need to follow if you were sending your products into the EU. The source for this legislation then is Eurelex, and again, the website's given on the page there. This is where EU legislation as it applies in the EU is currently held, and that will be updated as amendments are made at EU level. One of the main reasons for the UK leaving the EU was so that we had a say in what amendments happen to legislation. So we won't necessarily bring in changes which the EU make to their legislation. So we may well see consultations about whether we change the retained legislation that we hold. So that's where the legislation is. And hopefully I'll be able to make that a bit clearer as well as we talk about Natashas Law. So Natashas Law and this change around the requirement for information for pre-packed for direct sale or PPDS foods, this is the biggest change to allergen labelling in recent times. So very important to understand what it is and decide whether it applies to you. In terms of how the legislation works together then, we have the EU legislation, which is still, if you're sending products into the EU, applicable, and that's the Food Information to Consumers Regulation. Because we've retained that into our national law, that is still relevant to us. And at the moment, I'm going to say us, I mean us in the UK and particularly GB. So that at the moment, as I'm speaking to you in early 2021, hasn't changed. So at the moment, those two pieces of legislation are still aligned. In our national legislation, then, we have the FIR, so the Food Information Regulations. And this is our national legislation that implements and enforces the FIC. I should say as well, in terms of retained legislation, if you're reading retained legislation, you should also be looking at any relevant EU exit legislation, which helps make that legislation that we've retained work properly in effect in the UK. So that's the FIR. Natashas Law and this change to the Prepap for direct sale legislation is actually an amendment to the FIR. So Natashas Law, as it's colloquially called, is actually an amendment to the Food Information Regulations. And we now have the statutory instruments for all 4 devolved nations, so England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and they all are implemented, or rather come into force, from the 1st of October 2021. There is no implementation or transition period. We are in it. There's no time after that from which to comply with the legislation. So what Natashas Law is doing then, just to remind you, is it's placing a duty on food businesses to label PPDS, Prepap for direct sale products, with both the name of the food, and by that I mean the legally compliant name of the food, for which there are 3 alternatives. It could be a legal name, which are generally laid down in legislation, like chocolate jam, for example. It could be a customary name, for which there's no list, but they're generally foods that consumers understand what they are without further description. And also the third option would be a legally compliant descriptive name of the food, and that's generally what you see on food products. Fancy names do not comply with that requirement to name the food. So it's got to be one of those 3 names that I've just described. So you need the name on there. You also need the full list of ingredients with the allergens emphasised. And that information needs to be on the package or on a label attached to the package. This screenshot or a picture here is from the FSA website. So that's showing you for a pack of sandwiches an example. So you can see cheese and pickle sandwich. That would be the fancy name. As I say, it's not a fully descriptive name. That would be a fancy name. The legally compliant descriptive name is mature cheddar cheese, pickle and butter in sliced malted bread. That's the example they've given us. And then they've given us that full list of ingredients following all the requirements of the FIC for providing a list of ingredients with the allergens emphasised. So what is Prepap for direct sale food? This is a flow diagram from the Food Standards Agency guidance, which I'll show you in a moment. But to be Prepap for direct sale, a food needs to meet all of the following 3 criteria. So is the food presented to the consumer in packaging? If it's not pre-packed food. So that's not PPDS. If it is in packaging, then it's packed. So that's yes to the first question. Is it packed before the consumer selects or orders it? If not, yes, if not, if it's not packed, is it packed before the consumer selects or orders it? No, then it's non-pre-packed, sorry. So I'm tying myself up in knots. See how confusing it is. Then it's non-pre-packed food. So it's not in packaging, it's non-pre-packed food. It might be that it gets put into packaging when you select it, in which case then it's packed at the consumer's request, which still complies with the definition we have for non-pre-packed food. If it is packed before the consumer selects or orders it, then it is pre-packed. Is it packed at the same place it's sold? We'll come back to this in a moment, but if it's not packed at the same place it's sold, it's packed somewhere else, then that means it is pre-packed food, and that's the majority of food that we see on supermarket shelves. It's not packed in that supermarket, it's packed elsewhere. If it is packed at the same place it's sold, then it's pre-packed for direct sale. So answer yes to all three of those questions, then the food is PPDS. Key to this then is the definition of pre-packed, and that we find that in FIC Article 2.2e. I'm going to take this line by line. So what pre-packed means is any single item for presentation as such to the final consumer or to mass caterers, and to mass caterers, consisting of the food and the packaging into which it was put before being offered for sale, whether such packaging encloses the food completely or only partially, and this next part we're told is very important, but in any event in such a way that the contents cannot be altered without opening or changing the packaging. So that's our definition of pre-packed, and pre-packed for direct sale foods would comply with that legislation to be seen as pre-packed for direct sale. In terms of where the food is packed, then I've heard people talk about, well, where the food is made. It's not down to where the food is made, it's where the food is packed. So it's pre-packed for direct sale if it's packed before being offered for sale by the same food business to the final consumer, either on the same premises, so it's been packed on the same premises where it's been offered for sale, on the same site, and from the FSA guidance, we're told that that includes a building complex, such as a shopping centre or airport terminal, for example, in which that same food business is operating from more than one unit. Or on other premises, if the food is offered for sale from movable or temporary premises. So think marquees, market stalls, mobile sale vehicles, for example. So there, if the food is offered for sale by the same business who packed it, again, is considered to be from the same site. Just a little note that food products which are sold through distance sales, so over the internet or phone, for example, so think your takeaways, are not affected by the new PPDS legislation. So there's not a requirement to provide the name and the list of ingredients in that particular circumstance on the food packaging. Just some examples which are different from examples I've spoken about previously. So things which are pre-packed for direct sale. Think about in-store bakeries, so in retail, in retailers, in supermarkets. Here, if they're okay, they might be baking those products or finishing baking those products in those establishments. As I said, it doesn't matter where the product is produced, it's where it's packed. And here, if those products are being packed in that store and sold to consumers from that store, then they would be pre-packed for direct sale, as long as they're packed before the consumer orders them. Another example, which I have spoken about quite a bit before, sandwiches. So sandwiches which are made up in a sandwich shop, packed before a consumer orders them, again, pre-packed for direct sale if they're being packed in that establishment on those premises. Things which are not pre-packed, I've just mentioned takeaways. So a pizza, for example, that you order over the phone and it gets delivered to you, that's not pre-packed for direct sale, that's distance sales. They're exempt from pre-packed for direct sale requirements. In this example, some sandwiches placed into bags. In that circumstance that you can see on the screen there, those contents can be altered. So that comes back to our, what does pre-packed mean? So those would not be pre-packed for direct sale because you can alter the contents without changing the packaging. Your takeaway coffee. If you go in and order that coffee, it's not already in that cup, then they are packing that at your request. Again, that is not pre-packed for direct sale. There is guidance available then. So the Food Standards Agency have a dedicated page on their website with the link on the slide there, which has guidance, a piece of guidance, a document on there, as well as lots of information on the site. There's technical guidance from the Food Standards Agency, which was issued in June 2020. And also they have a decision tool on their website to help you decide whether your food is pre-packed for direct sale. Moving on to our last section then, as I say, a little bit of future gazing and some possible future legislative developments to look out for. I've got my crystal ball there, look. Just going to touch on allergen management. So here we've seen some quite big developments over the past few months. So Codex Alimentarius Commission have adopted a code of practice on food allergen management for food business operators. That was adopted in October 2020. Codex is not legislation. It's used for international trade, but legislation can be based on Codex texts. So what this code of practice is doing is it's providing guidance to food business operators, that's FBOs, to develop policies and procedures to identify allergens in all areas of food production, preparation and service. So it covers everything from farm to fork, if you like. And then it talks about implementing allergen management practices, and it talks about controls. So these are controls to help prevent and minimize the potential for allergen cross-contamination that's obviously a risk to people with food allergies. It talks about preventing and minimizing potential for undeclared allergens, and that's their presence in food due to errors in the supply chain. It talks about ensuring correct allergen labeling is applied to pre-packaged foods. And also, where foods aren't pre-packaged, it's about providing accurate, correct information on allergens to consumers where food is not pre-packed, so in restaurant settings for food sold loose, for example. So I said already, this isn't legislation. It's very important and very useful guidance, code of practice. But legislation, excuse me, can be derived from this. And we have already seen that. So in the EU, we have Commission Regulation 2021-382, which amends the general hygiene legislation, and it's amending the annexes to that piece of legislation. So the general hygiene legislation, providing that general legislation around hygiene for all foodstuffs. What the amendment has done is it's aimed to improve food safety in the EU by bringing the EU legislation into line with new international standards, so basically into line with that Codex code of practice. This legislation entered into force on the 24th of March 2021, and it applies to the EU, so the EU version of the legislation has been amended. This hasn't been brought in GB at the moment. This amendment then, it's amending both Annex 1, which is about primary production, so farm level hygiene requirements, and also Annex 2, which is general hygiene requirements for all food business operators. And to paraphrase what they're doing, I've sort of pulled together the amendments for both those annexes in this next paragraph. So they're talking about equipment, conveyances, containers used for harvesting, processing, handling, transport, storage of any of the allergenic substances, which we know the list of, hopefully, they're in Annex 2 to the FIC. They're saying that any of those things, those conveyances, containers, equipment, shouldn't be used for any products, ingredients which don't contain allergens unless they've been cleaned and checked. And that checking is at least for the absence of visible debris of that substance or product, so of that allergen. So that's been brought into the EU legislation, and we need to keep an eye out and see what happens for GB. That's all from me in terms of the legislation. just pop up our contact details there if you have any questions following this presentation. Thank you very much. I shall stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you very much, Helen, for that really excellent presentation on a really complex, challenging area. And I, as I'm sure you can imagine, have seen several presentations around this area, and very often you come away thinking, but there are still further questions that I would like to see resolved. But that was a really, really clear presentation, so thank you. If people do have questions, please do submit them to the anaphylaxis campaign via our website. We will then pass them on to Helen, and we will publish the answers on our website for corporate members to see. I hope you found this presentation extremely useful. Do pass it on to other people as well, so that as many people as possible can gain from it. And also do support our Allergy Awareness Week. We're showing this presentation as part of that, but please continue to support us in this way. And thank you again, Helen, for all your help.